in your opinion, what is that connecting of the dots that addicts go through in sex addiction, where they experience this shift in recovery, where things begin to flow, they become easier? I'm here with David Fawcett, co-founder of Seeking Integrity. Happy to have you here. This is a really a gift. So I'm thankful. I'm very thankful for this time. David, in your opinion, what is that connecting of the dots that addicts go through in sex addiction, where they experience this shift in recovery, where things begin to flow, they become easier?
Yeah, I think that there's that aha moment, right? When suddenly I think, and for most people, it's takes them by surprise and they realize, oh my God, the things that used to be driving me toward meetings feeling like a drudgery and now kind of feel good. And I think that really is this where the balance shifts slightly and people really start to benefit from the connection that comes with the recovery group and realizing we're not alone, kind of breaking open those compartments of secrecy, and just our world shifts. And I think that it just hits a tipping point. I think it's a gradual process, but the realization comes quite suddenly sometimes. People realize, yeah, they actually enjoy these meetings. They're getting more out of it. And the lure of those addictive triggers start to fade. Not that they're gone, but they certainly fade for the most part. So I think this is a kind of reaping the rewards, if you will, of working whatever recovery program they're working.
Yeah, I don't even like the word recovery. In our program, we call it self-mastery, because it's like, recovery, I think it comes with it, the stigma of like, oh, I'm sick and there's something I need to do to change. Whereas self-mastery, when we're thinking about this, it's an intimacy disorder, right? It's this way of being where you have removed the humanity from certain aspects of yourself and aspects of relationships. And so I love to call it self-mastery, because it's like, guys, this is not, this is work. I think the gift that this addiction brings men is, this is stuff that we should have been taught originally. And then because we weren't, this is stuff that we should have, really fixed sooner than later. So I know your wife doesn't feel like it's a blessing. But the gift that this brings men from the work that they're forced to do on themselves is a gift, because honestly, it makes, outside of your marriage, this is really what life's all about, being able to be with people, which kind of brings us to the topic today it's a really neat topic. And I'm glad you brought it up, David, this concept of separating from your emotions, separating from self, and what that does to relationships, for one, but what that also does to open the door to addiction. So I think let's start there. For those listening, why does separating from your emotions open the door to addiction? Because this is a common thing, not just within sex addiction, but we see this within every addiction. Why is that kind of the gatekeeper to these addictive tendencies?
No, for sure. And just to underscore your point about the ramifications of that being an intimacy disorder. When I was doing my first book, so the subtitle I was playing with was Reclaiming Healthy Sex and Intimacy. And I'm a recovering addict too, not a sex addict, but substance use. But I realized any addict really never got that stuff in the first place. We're not reclaiming it. We never learned how to do that. And I think, and that goes to your point about this compartmentalizing of stuff and this disconnect, if you will. And in most of the people that I've worked with, if not all the people, frankly, there were reasons why in their family of origin or early on when it was practical and even beneficial to disconnect from feelings, right? Maybe there was an active addiction in the household, or abuse, or some kind of trauma, or whatever, and it was dangerous somehow to show up and have a feeling and have feelings in general. So I think kids are very malleable, and they kind of very easily develop these compartments that help us survive, literally, emotionally or physically, at some point in our lives. But then that kind of traps us as we get older, because we are not really able to access some of those different emotional feelings that we need to develop healthy and satisfying, for that matter, emotional relationships, connections. It really sort of separates us. I think it's a lifelong thing that has to be kind of undone and almost relearned.
Well, you bring up something. You brought two things there that are really imperative, because the bulk of the men watching this are high achievers, entrepreneurs, executives. And there's no data to support what I'm going to say, but I think every therapist would agree. High achievers not all the time, but quite often abandon self earlier than a lot of other folks. And if you read kind of the books around, hypersensitive kids, which I think a lot of high achievers, they spend a lot of their life trying to prove and deny their hypersensitivity. But I think a lot of people who accomplish a lot of things in life were hypersensitive boys. And hypersensitive, again, it's so sad that that's been seen as a bad thing, because if you think about it, how do we make money? How do we have meaningful relationships? We sense things in others. So hypersensitivity, it's really sad that it's been seen as a weak thing. So when you look at Gandhi, Jesus, these stories of these figures who everyone talks about and admires, Martin Luther King Jr., these are very sensitive individuals. They did not choose violence. They did not choose peacocking and posturing. They sensed things, and they were actually capable of great change. And we name streets and churches after these people to this day because of the impact that they had. So you said two things. One was, I totally agree with you. I think, as a high achiever yourself, this concept of like recovery and returning, it's kind of tough for a high achiever, because it's like, man, they gave up on self so long ago, kind of pre-memory, that it's like, return to what? I don't even remember, I've remodeled myself so many, this is things that my men say, I've been such a chameleon for so long, and it's worked out so well for me with women and school and careers success, that it's like, return to what? Right. It's like, I don't know which version of myself to return to. You said that. So I'd love to hear your take on that. And also love to hear your take on why people pleasers are banned in self.
How long do we have today? There's a lot of material there. I think, this idea of abandoning self, and to go back to the beginning question you asked, I think maybe the kernel of that awareness, when that shift happens, is when we kind of discover the core of who we are, right? The real core, the authentic core, if you will, or whatever term you want to use. I think that, because it is there. It's just, I think we're often disconnected from it, and we just can't access it because it's just so variable depending on the situation and the context. But I think a lot of the time, the doorway to healing that, I think, comes with the pain we experience or inflict on people we love by acting out in these addictions. That oftentimes, I know at Seek Integrity, we read impact letters that often are read during a disclosure, but we call it a treatment letter to separate it. But it's the idea of the spouse writing in while they're in an inpatient setting. And that really is kind of a way to break through some of this. And for the first time, often they can experience the pain they might have inflicted. And that just is a little crack in some of the denial that really becomes an opening to start feeling it. And that's the motivation, by the way, too, if they want to heal the relationship or heal their relationships, not even the marriage. Maybe the marriage is over, but soon people realize these dynamics influence all their relationships. It's actually, and we don't have to give up that hypersensitivity you mentioned, because I do think that's an asset. I think that makes a good therapist. That makes a good doctor. That makes a good almost anything, right? Because you can read people and you can understand what's going on. So I think that's a gift that we don't want to separate ourselves from, but we also don't want to cut off the rest of us. And so I really started to learn that. And by the way, that process of starting to learn, I guess we can call it compassion or empathy. Oftentimes when these guys are sitting in group, we read the letters in group. When their own spouse is reading, when that letter's being read, they're often like dissociated and disconnected. But when the other guys, when their peers' wives' letters are being read, wow, they can hear that. And that often is the hook that kind of helps people start to find a way to discover and feel some of these emotional connections, which is really a critical task, I think, in recovery.
Oh, 100, absolutely. And I think to go to what you said, I think just so men who are listening can understand why this happened. One of my therapists once said to me, and I liked his approach. He said, you've made this little kid in you the enemy. And again, for people who don't resonate with inner child work, just for everybody listening to this, you don't have to do the inner child. If that doesn't resonate, you could do authentic self. You could do, whatever resonates with this idea that a person was born with a purpose and a calling and a unique set of abilities and skill sets to impact the world. Every person, whether that be poetry, art, entrepreneurship, nonprofits, whatever your calling is, you were born with that calling, and then whether you allowed it to do what it's supposed to do or you formed it into something else. So again, when David and I are talking about these things, if you don't resonate with the concept of the inner child, which I know a lot of the men in my group don't, it's just a very uncomfortable thing for them. Hey, no worries. We call it something different. Essentially what David and I are talking about is the only time people use inner child is they're trying to get you to say, hey, there was once a time where you weren't stressed out about your 401k. You didn't worry about the amount of fat on your stomach. There was a time where you just wanted to be you. And that was your biggest goal. And so when we talk about the adaptation, so this is kind of where I'm going with this is, the therapist told me, well, Roland, you demonize this little boy. Because again, my dad was not my dad told me not to role model after him. And so it was a very confusing message as a kid. It's like, oh, I really, really like you. But here he is. He's saying, oh, no, don't get fat like me. Don't get stuck into a dead end, low paying career like I did. Don't talk poorly about yourself like I did. So it's like, oh, gosh, okay, well, I love my dad. I think he's awesome. But he's telling me don't do anything. And so here I am, this 4-year-old, like, okay, who do I choose? Well, who do I choose? I chose Arnold Schwarzenegger, Hulk Hogan, Sylvester Stallone, James Bond, and these were all men that my dad admired. He would watch the TV, and even my mom. My mom would see Pierce Brosnan at the time was James Bond, and she loved him. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, if my dad loves him and my mom loves him, then these are the people who I should become. And the reason I share that short story is, this sensitive version of me had no place because I'm looking at these guys who clearly everyone in this country admires. And I'm like, well, that's clearly not me. So I need to find a way to be more like them. And that's that initial abandoning of self, is it's like, well, I'm not going to feel anymore because they don't feel, and they just blindly sleep with women and beat people up. And work out. And so it's like, all right, well, I'm going to go dominate, be superior, work out, and sleep with women. And hopefully things add up and I turn into one of these guys. So the abandoning of self, it's that subtle. And I think that's the thing that a lot of men don't realize is it was very subtle. It was very innocent. It was very advantageous. It made a ton of sense at the time because it's like, well, I'm toast in this world if I'm this way. So what do I need to become so I'm not? How would you, do you resonate with that? Is there another way that you would, for people who are trying to understand the concept of when and how and why they abandon self, anything that you would say in addition to that to kind of help them understand this idea?
I think that's a really, really well stated and perfectly describes this process that's kind of inadvertent, right? It's not a conscious one. Sometimes we say, well, we'll choose this or that, but then kind of we start moving that direction in many ways that we're not even aware of. And so, I think that's totally true. And there's actually benefits and rewards, right, for continuing that abandonment of self, because as we get older, there may be financial rewards or status rewards or things that give us validation, right? And I think everybody wants validation. Is not a bad thing. It's just kind of how we get it. Sometimes we can distort what we're getting and it doesn't feel authentic and then we need more, and that becomes a cycle of itself. But I think that process you described is really well stated, because I think it's essential and core to these addictive processes to understand when did that happen and who was left behind, right? Or who's, what part of me is still there. And by the way, for people that resist inner child, and I totally get that too. It's not, that model doesn't mean, it's not meaningful for everybody, but I like IFS approaches to parts work. There's a part of me, right? That's an old child part that may be a rescuer or a fearful one or whatever. So sometimes whatever metaphor we use, I think it's important to find a way to kind of at least start a dialogue with that part of ourselves, because that really starts the healing process. And by the way, that when we talk about intimacy and how necessary that is, compassion, empathy, intimacy, all those skills, vulnerability for recovery, it has to start with us, right? We want to heal our relationships, our adult relationships, our marriages, but really we also are disconnected from ourselves. And until we can connect with that inner child, that those parts of ourselves, whatever metaphor you want, we need to really accomplish that before we can sort of successfully engage in building relationships, meaningful relationships with other people.
Yeah, I always tell everybody the self doesn't ever forget that it's a self. You can try to confuse it and come up with some sort of, oh, I need to work out and buy this and go to this gala and buy a table here. And, if I'm seen doing all these things and I have this certain car and I'm in part of this country club, you can try to come up with a recipe. But I always say exactly what you said, David. You can't unself the self. The self knows what it is. And that's the reason why, you do, a lot of my clients aren't super fond of therapists, and it's because they find these conversations very trivial, somewhat useless. Why am I talking about why do we need to talk about these parts of me? And again, I get every time that here's how I resonate with that. I was that guy too. And so, but what David and I are saying today is, here for anybody listening who has children, this is my best way of trying to articulate this is people love their children if they're honest with themselves, usually more than their spouse. They might say they don't, but I mean the love and authenticity towards a child, it's just the compassion and grace and it's a very unique relationship that really outside of your children you don't really have. And here's where I'm going this way is I believe the reason you have that relationship with your child is because you witnessed its existence. It was nothing. It was two separate people, an egg and a sperm. It became a human being that grew inside of somebody's belly, and then it popped out into the world. And so it's essentially a miracle, really, if you think about it. I mean, this is this life form, and this person's going to grow up to potentially run a Fortune 500 company or go to a university and teach. I mean, it's this little tiny, wrinkly, nasty thing is going to grow up to become a person who makes an impact, and it's a miracle. And so my reason I'd say that is because we witnessed that miracle, we have this. This baby could never do any wrong, even if it did grow up and got into a wrong crowd and then ended up in prison. We would never think anything less of this child because we witnessed it being perfect, and then we saw it have a bad friend crowd, and the friend crowd got worse, and then they made some bad. We saw it happen, and so we still remember holding that 6-month-old who did no wrong. That's the point of this inner child work is. You were born too. Your wife was born. That person you hate was born. And I think if we could, the concept of inner child work is if we could just remember that at one day that person that you now despise was a 6-month-old, and that the things you despise were learned. This kid learned it. That's where we can interject some of the grace. What's the author of the drama, The Gifted Child? What's her name? She says something that I love. She says, for high achievers, they need to get over the delusion that they had a perfect childhood. And I really appreciate that advice, because the fact is, a lot of stuff went on in your life, and you became this person now. And a lot of it was man-made and learned, and that does not mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that it's going to make you fulfilled. It was learned. It seemed to be advantageous at the time, but this concept of like marrying yourself to everything that you learn and accepting it as truth and fact. I hear people all the time. I am not a people person. I am it's all of these I am statements, and it's like, wow, you know a lot about yourself. I'm interested. I'm interested in how you become. How I am one of the most common ones. I am not a good public speaker. And it's so funny because I said that, and now I get paid to do keynote speeches. And so it's like I could have married myself to that existence, and I would have deprived myself of one of the highest kind of human experiences that I've ever had. So anyways, for everyone to understand, if you do have kids, in the same way, you were once a kid that could do no wrong, and you've become this piece. So which brings me to kind of the next topic, which was what you and I were talking about, was this separation from emotions. And I think a lot, unfortunately, culturally, our society has devalued them, especially amongst high achievers. We see them as a nuisance and an inconvenience. So anytime we're experiencing a negative emotion, it's a barrier slowing us down. It's depriving us of joy. And so it's like, okay, I need to get this thing out of my life. And typically they don't seek therapy to actually get it out of their life. They just use dopamine to shift their focus and motivation on something different. To me, what I have learned, and I'm curious if you can kind of reframe this in a way that would be more beneficial to the listeners, but the reason that there's kind of two ways. You can either do the inner child work and kind of find a way to reconnect with the idea that you were once perfect, or, to me, a really easy hack, David, is emotions, because emotions come from that. So it's like, okay, let's say you don't want to do all of that shenanigans. Okay, fine. But if you could feel, the feelings typically come from that core original self. And so it's, when you hear therapists always say, hey, how does that make you feel? When that happened, how did you feel? They're actually really helping you, because they're giving you what I consider the shortcut to a lot of painful therapy, which is, if you would just pay attention to how you feel, you could essentially almost coach yourself into success if you would be able to accurately assess these emotions, which I would say, problem number one is we don't feel them. Problem number two is we judge them and label them. And so an emotion that actually meant something different, you decided meant something else. Can you try? I'd love for you to come at it from a different angle to try to sell. David, I would love for you to try to sell to a high achiever why they need to feel more.
I love the idea of this kind of being a hack, right? Because feelings are in the present tense. Feelings are the here and now. I look at any kind of emotions as an information system, as a data management system. It's a dashboard, right? It's how we're doing at any given time. So when a feeling pops up, and the idea of a feeling, by the way, is to be identified, expressed, and released, not to be held on to, as a lot of people kind of do sometimes, especially with anger, resentments, or negative feelings. Sometimes we kind of hang on to for whatever reason. But I think when we can just recognize them and see, it tells us something. It tells us about what's going on. But it also is directly, it's like software, as I said. It goes back to those early patterns, and rather than we're not going back and mucking around in that stuff for years in therapy. I think it's just, if we can start to look at our patterns, and just be curious about it. And I love some of the concepts of mindfulness, which is just an observation and non-judgmental. And you said that, right? I'm feeling lonely right now. What's that about? Like, I'm surrounded by crowds. I'm really feeling happy. Like, where did that come from? And if we're just curious about that, without saying, oh, that's stupid, or why am I feeling that, or what an idiot I am, or whatever self-talk we have, to go back and just be curious about, what was the situation? What just happened? What is that reminiscent of? And I think gradually, by just noticing those things in real time, in the present tense, we can start to really observe and make sense of what's going on. And by the way, I think the addictive triggers, the addictive cravings, are all kind of capstones to those feelings, because a long time ago I learned, if I'm feeling lonely, I know a solution for that, right? I can go on porn, or I can masturbate, or I can hook up with somebody, or whatever I need to do, and that soothes that. And so gradually we start to lose touch with the lonely piece. We just start to experience a lot of cravings in our lives. But I think just noticing what's really going on, because I guarantee when you're having a craving to act out, you're probably not just horny. It's probably something else going on. And it doesn't have to be bad stuff either. It can be good things, right? I work with a trial attorney now who works in financial stuff. He gets huge rewards at a time. And when he goes out, and it's the win, right? The win after a really heated contest in battle, right? He dominates, and he goes out and uses cocaine and hookers. That's the celebration, right? So it's a good thing, but he could do it in a better way that's not so self-destructive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Your
software.
Yeah, our definition of emotions in my program, because again, I think high achievers just have a different outlook on a lot of this. Their calling in life is impact, right? And so it's like the constant question is, well, what do I do with it? What do I do with it? And so in our program, we focus a lot on what to do with an emotion, because that is just how the high achiever, we, everyone, it's like, oh, it's not about doing, it's about being. Well, high achiever, they're like being, I don't, to them, it's like, I don't want to be, I want to do, if what good is walking around barefoot with dreadlocks and meditating. If everyone did that, the world would halt and there would just be a lot less progress. So the high achievers is like, hey, cool, I'll go wear no shoes and meditate. And when I take all these awesome nuggets, I'm going to go into the world and create these changes. And so when we speak about emotions, here's, Roland's definition of them. I always say an emotion tells you whether or not the reality you have created will allow you to be the person that you were meant to become. So what I mean by that is, if you experience a positive emotion, the message is, yes, Roland, do more things like this. If I experience a negative emotion, not good or bad, all emotions are good. So a positive emotion or a negative emotion. So if I experience a negative emotion, then the message is, Roland, do less of this. And so what that has allowed me to do is, as a high achiever, I can now grab that nugget and do something with it. So for example, a very short example of a negative emotion would be, you get cut off in the parking lot. It's Christmas. You're in a hurry. It's Christmas Eve. You need to buy something. You got your turn signal on for the one spot that's left, and you've been waiting for this spot, and this lady's taken forever to load the back, and she's like checking her phone, and like you've been waiting 2 minutes for her to just back out of the spot. And she backs out, and somebody who comes around the corner who didn't know that you were waiting for 6 or 7 minutes pulls right in. And you feel the emotion in you. We would call that, it's not a bad emotion. It is a negative emotion is what we would call it. You jump to the conclusion of labeling it, saying, that guy, somebody should take him out, and he needs to be punished. He has no respect for mankind. People like that shouldn't even exist. Someone needs to teach him a lesson. Maybe if you have real anger problems, you might roll your window down. You might get out of the car. There might become some sort of a confrontation of some sort of injustice, is how you are doing this. Or the negative emotion is the opposite. Here's how I hear it, Roland. If you're going to think that about a stranger who you never met, you're never going to become the person that you need to become. And so that's the danger of labeling these emotions, is if the emotion is this justice needs to be served, this gentleman needs to be punished. If that's my interpretation of the emotion, then I'm going to live a very hostile, aggressive life, because there are so many injustices. Or the unpleasant emotion could be, Roland, stop thinking that about someone you've never met. Stop assuming that he saw that you were waiting. Stop assuming that that your needs are better than his. He actually might have a really damn good reason to come in there. Maybe he did see you waiting and he actually has a better reason to need to park sooner than you. And that's, the negative emotion is, hey, stop thinking about this person you've never met. Because if that's your worldview, this is going to be it's going to be very difficult for you to accomplish what you meant to accomplish. Hearing me say that, and our take on emotions and how we handle it in our program, what's come up for you?
Yeah, it's just so important, this topic, because I think we're talking the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand maybe a different perspective, right? And that is the definition of empathy and compassion. And I think that's an essential piece that we need to employ in self-mastery. What came up for me, honestly, was an example of my own life. And that, when my dad was very sick, it was the middle of winter, he was actually dying, and they airlifted him to a hospital some miles away in the city. My mother, who was elderly, never drove. In the middle of that, in the winter, started to drive to the hospital to be with him. And she got into this sort of city, and this woman behind her, it was like laying on the horn and, get out of the way, and why, you stupid woman, why are you driving at night anyway? And then my mother told, my husband was there, lifted, I don't know, I'm trying to find the hospital. And of course the woman led her to the hospital. But it was that just understanding, okay, this is not just some stupid person out making trouble in my life, but they have a reason for being here. So, and just that ability to understand, but it's the story we tell ourselves. And just really, if we can avoid doing that and just get get the facts, or at least check our own assumptions. So I think it totally changes that. But I think that's really important, because that understands then we can make this shift where we can sort of understand where something might be coming from, or at least not assume based on our own stuff.
And you can learn to enjoy my, I think one of the biggest nuggets there is you can learn to enjoy bad emotions. Because again, if they're all good, which is, I subscribe to that now. I didn't used to. I was a very angry person for a majority of my life. But if every bad emotion is actually a good, if all of them are good, then you can learn to actually enjoy a difficult day, because you could see, man, I created a reality for myself to live in that's hell on earth. And if I'm not careful, I could do it tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And that's, that's really what, to me, emotions are a gift, because that's really the message I hear is, Roland, think less things like this, because if you don't, tomorrow is probably going to be very similar to today. And so when I do feel a negative emotion, I'm thankful for it, because statistically, assuming I act on it and change the things I need to change, tomorrow will be better. And that's, and so for those, the reason I went this angle, David, was for those kind of struggling with emotions, for those struggling with the inner child and the authentic self. Let's say you have some spiritual wounds and atheism's your jam, which I resonate with because I have a lot of those wounds myself. This process was harder for me, David, because I kept not wanting to do this foo-foo, woo-woo stuff that they kept wanting me to do, because I'm like, hey, you don't get it. I'm a high achiever. I'm here to make change. I'm here to facilitate progress. I don't enjoy this weird stuff that you're trying to get me to do. And I now, in hindsight, wish I wasn't so rigid, because what I learned from a somatic experience therapist was, all throughout the day, you're getting these, everything you do, you're getting some emotional response above or below baseline. And if you are really able to feel those, as a doer, and most of my clients we're professional doers, very good at doing. Now with her teaching me how to feel all of those things, I can now summate, I can become a collector of these awesome things that make me more Roland, and I can become a uncollector, a cleaning out of the house of the things that bring me away. And so really it's like I'm playing the game for any emotion, because I'm either going to be able to double down on it, or I'm going to be able to take that to my therapy or therapy groups and get this thing out of my life. But either way, tomorrow is going to be better than today, but it will only be better, David, if I feel, because if I don't feel, I don't have any sort of, that now I'm leaning on man-made. I guess that's the last thing I'll say before I'll turn it over to you to speak on this. But, if you don't feel, then you are relying on man-made influences and outside nonsense and your interpretations of accuracy. That is why importance to me of emotions are so important to me, because to me, it's in this crazy world full of a bunch of man-made nonsense that who knows what's right or wrong. Honestly, the justice system, there's some things on there I'm like, I don't know if that's justice. So because so many things have been created by man, how do we know what's true and what's not? And to me, the answer to that question is emotions. What else do we have?
Totally. And I think the bottom line point here, and you indicated, is that emotions are not mutually exclusive from high achieving and doing or anything else, right? It's actually a benefit to have those two things connected, because there's feedback between the two. So yeah, I think otherwise we're, as you say, we're sort of susceptible to the stories we tell ourselves, the stories out there, this kind of influences, sometimes not healthy influences either. So I think just that those emotions really provide a window or an avenue, an information system to get to the core of what's going on. And I think, ironically, because I think a lot of us grew up probably not trusting emotions and discarding them, but if we can learn to trust them as adults, once we identify them, I think that's probably the truest indicator of what's going on, right? And that goes to our own sense of integrity, our own sense of morality, our own needs, our own wounds, right? It's all there. And I think just we can really, for the first time, understand where we're at, what's going on in the world based on that information system, and not all the noise that floats around us in the world. Including, by the way, I think sort of some of the addictive processes that are also represent a noise and a distraction and kind of pull us out of the present. So I think just learning to use that as kind of a baseline, as a grounding. I think it's very important for all of us to be grounded, emotionally and whatever sense, physically too sometimes. But that's really, if we're basing our living and our decisions and our actions on emotions and feelings because we have an awareness of them, that also is very grounding in terms of keeping us kind of in the moment, not going down tangents, not going down rabbit holes. And actually it's quite efficient way to live. As you say, we could repeat that same bad day the next 30 days in a row until we get it, or we can, and I love it. I'm an AA fellowship, so for the most part in my own work with alcoholism in my past, but there's this concept of like, at any point in the day, you can start the day over, right? So if I'm having a terrible day and by 12 o'clock, instead of saying, this is really messed up and continue to suffer all day, I can say, let's start this day over, right? Let's do a reboot. And that is this kind of sense you're doing. We have a choice. We're not trapped in here. We have choices. And again, that agency, that self-control or self-mastery, to use your word, is essential, right? And that's the whole point. But I think emotions feed that; they're not exclusive from that.
Well, I think the danger, especially for high achievers, David, is when you split from that. Which for most high achievers, it's a long time ago. So for those of you who are like listening to this, and it's like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what these guys are talking about. I get it, because I split from my emotions officially when I was 9. I mean, I divorced them and they were out of my life at 9 years old. It was just things, I couldn't handle it anymore. Went full dorsal and just kind of went off into Roland's world where I, at least until I was 18, it was like, okay, what do I need to do to get these people to shut up and leave me alone? And then when I'm 18, I can now go and live. And so if we think about it, 9 to 18 for a decade, I'm living in this Mormon household with my parents. And they are not asking me about what I want. They're not asking me about how I feel. Every time I brought it up, they tell me, I don't care. You have to do what we say. They didn't say it maybe quite as that brutal, but that was the vibe was,
right.
I don't care if you don't like soccer, you're going. I don't care if you don't want to go to church for 3 hours, you're going. I don't care if you don't want to go to Boy Scouts on Wednesday, you're going. I don't care if you want to go to seminary in the morning at 6 a.m. before high school every day for 4 years, you're going. And so the vibe was, okay, fine, I will do this and I'll go live over here. And it was a complete severing, if you will, the truest definition of a double life. I got one over here for these people so they don't punish me and take my freedom away, because that's what would happen if they found out what I actually felt and what I actually wanted. And then I'm just going to live over here. And then at 18, I can finally stop doing this and live full time in Roland world. That Roland world was getting built up and built up and built up, but it was all man-made. And so there was no emotions in there. There was no, I had all these idols and people I was going to become. And that was supposed to make me happy, was the sale. And I think for everybody listening to this, that's process addiction. I know sex addiction is the common word. I actually prefer the term process addiction because yes, sexual behavior will be linked into some of those things, sex appeal, gender roles, different things like this. But again, when I'm working with, high achievers and we're really trying to get this out of our life so that we can feel, be connected, re-inject humanity. I think focusing on the sex addiction is almost a little too small. When we focus on the process addiction, which is what are these brain processes that make me who I want to be? That's where we can start making bigger progress. And that's where you're going to start feeling is when you start to look at, this double life. That's really what it is it's like, I like these brain processes because they make me more of who I want to be. Money is probably the best example of this. I like making a lot of money because the brain processes, that makes me better, that makes me superior, it makes me accomplished, it makes me desirable, it means I've done a good job. That's a process addiction. And very similarly, women and sex can be brought in that. Oh, if I can have women of this caliber lusting after me, that makes me this. And so for a lot of my men, it's a math equation. And then they wonder why they're so damn unhappy and empty. And it's because that math equation was invented between usually ages of 10 and 21. And you didn't know back then that the game of life is to spit out positive emotions of joy, peace, wholeness, connectedness. That's why we're here. From 9 to 21, that's not the formula. The formula was, how do I make my biceps look like this? How do I get women of this caliber to find me attractive? And unfortunately, to me, that's what I see. I see in my groups a bunch of men who may jump to a bunch of conclusions about what a fulfilling life was, largely between the ages of 10 and 25. And then they never re-updated this process addiction. And now they're doing all of this shit that is tormenting their life. And they feel like, I'll turn it over to you, because I'd love for you to speak to this. Here's the thing, though. They feel like they're crushing it, David. To them, it's like, I don't get it. I'm exceeding. Here's my 28 things that I wanted to be when I was, 15 or 18-year-old boy. And I'm doing 10 times what I ever thought I was ever going to be able to do of all 25 of those. And so then I got this therapist telling me that I need to change. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. I'm crushing it. And I think that's really the challenge for the high achiever in this process addiction is there's a lot of confusion about why they're even here in the first place.
I think my way of describing this process you're speaking of is really this building of a false self, as the validation machine, if you will. And so I may have issues feeling less than, or feeling different, or somehow at a disadvantage, or whatever, not feeling good about myself as a young kid or a teenager. And so I learn, as in the process you really beautifully articulated, these are ways that I can start to correct that, right? I can get validation, my biceps, or money, or the right address, or the right car, or the right clothes, or blah, blah, blah. And we build this system of things, validation, thirst trap stuff, that provides it, but we're still kind of unhappy, because at some point inside us, and we may be out of touch with this, but inside us, we realize all this validation from the world is for all this stuff on the outside, but it's still not penetrating to who I feel I am, the part of me that needs this so badly, the part of the boy in me that needs this so badly, right? And so this machine builds and builds, and it becomes kind of a trap, because we don't really know what to do, what else to do. This is this is our strategy. And so I think to kind of learn how to get validation. And again, validation is not the enemy. I think validation is great. We need it as human beings. It gives us dopamine and adrenaline and all kinds of other stuff. But I think finding ways that are perhaps healthier to get that, or more realistic, or and again, it doesn't mean that we have to stop going to the gym or stop wanting a nice car. No. But I think it also we have to understand that's not necessarily the formula to lead a happy and successful life, right? There's other stuff. And in my experience in my own life with clients, that in addition to all that other stuff, I think it's connection, it's human connection, it's those relationships that really feed me. And I think a lot of us grow up thinking, well, people are unreliable. I certainly don't want to, put my happiness dependent on anybody else. But I think that vulnerability and ability to trust, at least some people, and as we grow older, is really satisfying and essential to kind of counterbalance that, the material stuff, processes that we need.
Yeah, and you brought up a really great point, David. I think for everybody listening, no one's telling you to stop making money. No one's telling you to stop buying these luxurious items that you want. I would actually even go further to say the motive behind a lot of high achievers' materialism and superficiality is actually, if you look at the motive, it's actually a good motive. The story is, if I become this guy, I will be important. I will have made a difference. I will be more connected. I'll be wanted. I'll be one with everyone. So I just want everybody to understand, because I know there's a lot of guys listening to this who have been called a narcissist. They've been called a lot of these really, and it's hard to get heard. It's hard to hear that, because I think at the core, a lot of these men, they're doing all this for you. And I know it doesn't look like it. I know it doesn't look like it. And that's why someone's calling you a narcissist, because it looks like they're self-absorbed. The irony, at least in my work, is I've never had a single male in my program who did it for them. The motive was for everyone. It was to belong. It was to be a valuable member of society, was the motive. Now, yes, did they completely miss the mark? As somebody who did that, 100%. Your $250,000 car is not the way to make an impact. It turns heads for the wrong reason. They're turning their head because they've never seen a vehicle like that. They're not turning their head because of your unique abilities, your intellect, your ability to solve unique problems. And I think that's why the high achiever goes home, parks in the garage, and it feels empty, because really the esteem they're after will not be accomplished from driving that vehicle around town. It just, it's not hitting the mark. And it's the day that you, and to me, to answer the first question, that's to me, the day that things flip is when you realize you are not more of a respectable male because you're able to sleep with supermodels. The most respectable male is the one who is listening to his emotions. He's pouring into other relationships. He's, that's how you earn respect, not by collecting. And so I think the aha moment, at least for me, with amongst high achievers, is when they realize that the man they want to be acts differently than how they're acting. And it's that connection that's like, okay, I can keep all this nice shit and play this other game. They're not, you don't have to quit one to play the other. You can have a massive house and awesome cars, and you can share your intellect and unique abilities with people who need your help and allow the fulfillment to come into your life. So last thing I would say here as we wrap up, just give these guys some techniques that they can do. Because I think a lot of people are like, okay, Roland, David, I hear you. This is great. This all makes sense. But then there's always this question, which is the question I always asked was, all right, well, what do I do? Like, this is fine and dandy, but all you therapists do is talk about this wonderful way of existing, but you never tell me how to do it. So let's give some people some ideas. I'll lead with a couple of the ones that worked for me. Groups. So finding groups of men who you respect and admire who are doing this. In my opinion, especially amongst the high achievers, you got to do that. When you look at a guy who's taking home $1.8 million a year and he's trying to drop all this stuff that you and him have both played your whole life for something greater. And then you look around the room, there's a bunch of other men doing the exact same thing. To me, that was what got me to switch. Was I was like, okay, here's a bunch of guys who I respect, admire, and they all want it too. So I there's something I'm missing. If they all have everything in the world and they're wanting something else. So that was number one for me. Number two was somatic experiencing, this concept of retracing your day and putting pins in all of even the most subtle emotions ever. Because that's what those therapists will do for you. They'll be like, oh, did you see that intuition there? Did you see your first impulse was to do this? And I think a lot of us we are hunting for the negative, not all of these positive things about you. So for those of you who are like, oh, I don't want to go to a somatic experiencing therapist because she's going to make me talk about my painful. No. All my take homes from those therapists was she put pins in all of these really beautiful things that I do on autopilot. And now that I can do them on command, I'm 10 times the man I ever was. So those are kind of my number one and number two for people listening. David, what advice would you give men trying to tap into these feelings?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I'd beware of fantasy, because I think we can drop into our thoughts and that kind of keeps us trapped as well. We may not be acting out, we may not be doing those behaviors that got us in trouble, but in our heads, we're still half in trouble.
Yeah,
so
and fantasy, just so for everybody listening, is, oh, I'm going to go do this and I'll get attention. Oh, if I'm going to I should call, or again, fantasy doesn't have to be sexual. It can be, oh, this is going to be great. I'll get money here. This will feel good because I'll be seen by a bunch of people. So I just wanted to interrupt there for a second. Most high achievers do not run sexual fantasies. They run fantasies about being awesome, being superior.
Right. And it's running that fantasy kind of without engaging it, but it's keeping those pathways alive. Right. The other thing I see I've got a lot of guys falling into is kind of playing whack-a-mole with other behaviors, and including, my specialty is combining the process addictions plus the substance misuse. And so I think it's easy to just shift and wonder why we're not making good progress, but we've just shifted that compulsivity or that drive somewhere else. So just be really clear. And then the final thing is mindfulness, and a lot of people think mindfulness, that sounds pretty woo-woo kind of stuff. I have a very simple definition. That's just simply observing and not being judgmental about it. Very much that process you described with somatic experiencing. Okay, this is just observing what's going on. And it's tremendously informative and just so important. But that just being curious and non-judgmental.
I love that
stance is huge.
Yeah, I love that. I think I think you nailed it on the head. I think the thing that keeps people distant from their high achievers, distant from their emotions, is this infatuation with their process addiction, which is another way of fantasy. Just like, oh, I can't wait to do all these things and become awesome. I can't, they'll be out on a hike. How do I know this? Because I am one of these guys. They'll be out on a hike and you can't even enjoy the hike because the whole hike is thinking, oh, this will be so awesome. I'm going to come home and do that. Or, oh, I need to call that guy. Him and that, we could build this together. It's depriving yourself of the present moment, which is where where life happens. Everything happens here. And so this concept of not doing anything here, as a high achiever, I would be more scared of that than most people are. They're not scared of that enough. They take so much refuge in their process addiction. But I'm like, man, guys, imagine if that awesomeness was done here in today, how much further ahead you would probably be in all areas of life. David, what is, you're writing a new book. Is it done? Is it almost done? Tell us about that for those listening.
Yeah, no, it's out. It's available on Amazon as an ebook or in print. It's called Sex Under the Influence, Understanding and Healing from Sexualized Drug Use. And it just examines this combination of multiple behaviors. We're seeing an increase in guys using, especially amphetamines, but other drugs as well, testosterone and other.
Even THC and alcohol. I know there's a lot of men who are unable to maintain their sobriety and their wife is losing patience. And a lot of it is they use THC at the end of the day for whatever, sleep, and they act out. And so, it's, I think a lot of people hear this and they're like, oh, I don't do that. It's like, well, you might on a different scale. So, be open to it, because that's something I have heard. I hear so many men acting out in the evening and they know it due to alcohol, use of THC for sleep, stress release, whatever it is. And then a growing problem, David, is, and I don't know if listeners have done this before, but a growing problem that I've heard a lot of men is they will watch pornography and use cocaine, and the first time is an accident. And after that happens, I have a lot of men who are going to hotel rooms to do this and hiding this from their wife. They won't stay at the hotel. They'll go to the hotel room, engage in these behaviors. So anyways, if anybody's listening to that and you have dabbled with this, it's a very real problem and there's help and solutions. So David, that's awesome. We'll have the link available for people to read the book if that's something that they're interested in. Yeah, you bet. Perfect. David, thank you so much for your time. This was awesome.
My pleasure.
I appreciate this. I have a feeling this will be not the last time that we do this, because I don't know about you, but I feel like there was a lot that didn't go said that could have gone said. So I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, great time. Thank you so much.